you with chapter 25 information. I'll post this PowerPoint online and you'll notice that maybe there are some extra pictures or videos that I've included in the PowerPoint that I'm skipping over for the sake of this recording. But I just wanted to remind you that we're talking about the Gilded Age, and that previously in chapter 23 and 24, we had been talking about the presidential scandals and some of the other political scandals going on even at the local level, and also looking at the economic depressions. And then we had moved into talking about the ultra rich, the millionaires, your Rockefellers, your Carnegies, and how they are using the laborers to their advantage, which then prompts some of that populist movement of labor unions to be formed. So this chapter is really focusing on society and looking at who the people are that are living in America. As a refresher, just remember that we've talked about a group known as the Old Immigrants before, mainly from Ireland and Germany, okay? Recall in your knowledge about what I would call their push-pull factors, what pushes them from home, what pulls them to America, okay? Here is from Statista, looking at about over 8 million people that between 1870 and back to 1820 ended up coming to America, and you can see where they're coming from. So this slide here is a reminder of some of that backlash to the old immigrant movement, especially looking at the Know Nothing Party and the nativist movement. Some of the information more on the right of the slide might be a little bit old combined with new. So keep in mind that some of the immigrants were blamed for stealing the elections, looking at particularly a lot of the voting fraud that ended up happening in cities like New York, and looking at Boss Tweed. There's still going to be the blame even after the Civil War into the 1870s and 80s with the factory system that immigrants are taking jobs. And this would be true even like of the Chinese, because we had talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act and that public perception like in California about taking jobs. So this is new information for you. The new immigration is really looking at this high point of immigration between 1880 to 1820. And we're going to see a lot of new immigrants come in from Southern and Eastern European nations, looking at Poland, Italy, Greece, Hungary, Russia, those types of locations, okay? Realize that they will be culturally different from the old immigrants, and so it made it more difficult for them to assimilate into American life. They tended to settle in urban ethnic neighborhoods, and this is going to establish what become like tenements and your villages, if you will, like Little Italy, Chinatown, these types of places that get nicknamed based on the residents that tend to live there. The reason why people would congregate together is because you can speak the same language, you can observe your traditions, you can freely practice your religion, but you feel at home with people who are like you from your native land when you have uprooted yourself from there. So the question is, why do they come to America? Where do they go? A lot of it is looking at economic opportunities at this time period. In Europe, you are looking at starting some political upheaval that will much later on lead us to like World War I. And the idea of military conscription is looking at military draft and the fact that here in America at this time, we didn't have it. You also have religious persecution going on, especially like in Eastern Europe. Where did people go? As I mentioned before, they're settling in urban areas, large cities, New York City, Chicago. These apartment buildings become known as tenements. I'm not really a super big fan of using the term ghetto just because of some of the different meanings behind it. But if you basically think of tenements as being overcrowded apartments, maybe 5 or 6 stories high because we don't have elevators yet, one family living in a 1-bedroom place, you don't have indoor plumbing, maybe there's 1 bathroom per floor, that type of idea. The book on the right that I have a picture from is called How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis, and we'll talk about that more with a progressive era, but he documents what it's like for a lot of these immigrants to live in America at this time. This is just another image for you to see by numbers where people are migrating from into the United States. You can always pause on some of these pieces of information later on, but also take a look at this one from the Census Bureau, how many thousands and millions of people end up coming to America in these actual decades. So the challenges faced by these new immigrants, we've used the term nativism in the past, and we're going to add a new definition that could go along with it called xenophobia. And xenophobia is your intense or irrational fear and dislike of people from other nations, okay? And so, because of xenophobia, because of this idea of nativism, a lot of immigrants faced a hard time assimilating or coming into American life. Part of that is because they spoke different languages. They were maybe illiterate not only in English but maybe also in their or in their home language. They worked in those unskilled, low-paying jobs, especially at factories that business management would take advantage of. Okay. And the immigrants tended to be harder to unionize. A lot of it was because of the language barriers. If you think back to, like we talked about, the National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, and the American Federation of Labor, think about the different groups that were their members. So the reactions to it is going to be kind of a mixed bag. I would say definitely the xenophobia movement, but then also you have these different theories and different phrases, like you've probably heard of melting pot and cultural pluralism. So melting pot is more what our old immigrants had done, where they assimilated to become more American and blended into America. But now we're seeing more about this cultural pluralism movement, which is about the immigrants maintaining some of their own identity, what made them uniquely them, but more mixing in with Americans. And so cultural pluralism is oftentimes thought of like as a salad, where you're mixing everyone together to create like this new, beautiful America. The image that you see on here is by Puck. Remember, that's one of the newspaper magazines at this time period. And you can tell that this artist is basically showcasing the negative attitude towards immigrants at this time, as you have what we would assume is like a white American who has lived here in the United States, who's maybe down on his luck, out of a job. As you then see on the right-hand side, a boat, and it looks like all of these immigrants are streaming in, and maybe some business manager or owner is like welcoming them in. And it's like, but the man in the front is like, but I have a family, I have kids, who's like, where's my job? Who's taking care? So there were some opportunities for help for the new immigrants. One of those opportunities is going to be led by this woman named Jane Addams. You see her portrait on the top right there. She is in Chicago, and she founds what's called the Hull House. And the Hull House is a settlement house that basically provided housing, food, education for poor women and immigrants. They would sometimes offer babysitting services or daycare service, like if a woman needed to go do a job interview, that type of idea. But basically, Jane Addams helped spur other settlement houses in cities. You also have, during this time period, a movement for women's rights, as well as African American rights. And so for women's rights, a lot of it builds on what we had known about from the antebellum era, where we had started to talk about like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and some of that early like suffrage movement. And you probably recall me talking about from with the 15th Amendment, and that some women were upset that black men got the right to vote. And it wasn't that they were upset that they got the right to vote, but it was more like that the women were also left out of those opportunities. And so we will see the women's reforms pick up again. Women are going to be more working, and they'll be living in cities. They'll be working as secretaries, store clerks, telephone operators. And also women are going to be graduating from high school, attending universities. And so you actually see in this graduating class of 1898 from Oberlin College, a mixed gender graduating class, including women. In 1890, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed what became known as NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So for African American rights, it's going to focus around some key people that you should be aware of. As a reminder, these reforms are looking at, sharecropping, the Jim Crow laws, the black codes, and of course Plessy v. Ferguson that declared that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment. If you notice some of these images, on the top right is a Coca-Cola ad that says for white customers only. And then on the bottom left is a poll tax receipt that shows that you paid in order to go vote. And then on the bottom right is actually what's called a literacy test. And keep in mind that poll tax, the literacy test, is all different ways to prevent Black people from voting. So getting into some of the key people from this era, you have Booker T. Washington. So Washington was a former slave, and he believed and used for himself, after slavery had ended, hard work and education, and he eventually helped found the Tuskegee Institute, which became early on a school to train Black workers and teachers. When it came to race relations, he argued in favor of accommodation. What he believed is that Blacks should work hard, educate themselves, and earn the rights that they wanted. He did speak, and you can always pause and read more about the Atlanta Compromise. This is one of his quotes that when he was giving a public speech about this. And it would share like his sentiments. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts and was actually a very different opinion than Booker T. Washington. He was the first Black man to earn a doctorate degree from Harvard, and he opposed Washington's Atlanta Compromise from that previous slide, saying that he called for the immediate civil rights and the promotion of the talented tenth of young Black leaders. And here is one of his quotes. He said, "We claim for ourselves every single right that belongs to a free American, political, civil, and social, and until we get these rights, we will never cease to protest and assail the ears of America." So in 1905, Du Bois and other Black leaders led what became known as the Niagara Movement, and they demanded their end to segregation and discrimination, and they wanted economic and educational equality. What is interesting is that this meeting then eventually led to an organization that is still around today, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. George Washington Carver is another African American rights leader of this era. And he was born into slavery. He has a bit of an Iowa connection. He was born into slavery in Missouri, but ended up attending Simpson College and then later earned his bachelor degree and master degree in agricultural science from Iowa State University. He was recruited to go teach down at Tuskegee Institute, and his agriculture training wasn't necessarily popular, especially among people that came to take his classes, because a lot of Southerners believed that they already knew how to farm. And the students saw their schooling as like a means to escape farming. And so it was one of those conundrums of like, why are you teaching us about agricultural science and farming techniques when it's something that we already knew what to do? So chapter 25 has some random topics in it, that we basically touch on for society. And so one of them is about journalism. And in journalism, we're going to see a lot of mass media pop up here. And yellow journalism is this idea of sensational news stories. And you're going to get introduced in this chapter to two gentlemen, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And they are like the two newspaper magnates of the time period. We will hear more about them in our next unit on imperialism, but these are the two men that are basically helping create and spur the news movement in America. Literature, we also see a lot of like naturalism, rejecting the idea of romanticism. It's based more on social commentary and also some realism writing, like representing the matter of fact more truthfully, that type of idea. You may recognize some of these. I know if you're, I think in AP, like you guys read The Awakening. So you see from like The Awakening more about femininity and motherhood with the South. You see from Stephen Crane, the realist tradition. You see Mark Twain with Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn. Edith Wharton, The Age of Innocence, is like the insider's knowledge to the upper class in New York City. Theodore Dreiser with Sister Carrie, looking at more like a naturalist objective about a woman who moves to the city and realizes her own American dream. So once again, like uniquely American stories. The city beautification movement kind of goes along the line, if you think back to chapter 24, when talking about Carnegie and like the gospel of wealth, that the wealthy had the responsibility to provide and to like provide philanthropic opportunities to help the poor. The city beautification movement is kind of viewed as one of those. Basically, the idea of introducing like beautification to cities in order to create like a harmonious, like more social order to help increase the quality of life for people. There was criticism behind it saying that people were more concerned with the aesthetics instead of the social reform, because who could use like Central Park in New York City? It's going to be more the wealthy because they had more the time to go on a leisurely stroll. But the argument was that this beautification movement would add to the overall benefit of everyone in that society. And you have one of the spearheads, the people are Frederick Law Olmsted. So then another miscellaneous topic to wrap up this chapter is looking at the temperance movement, okay? So this is building on that idea from the antebellum era of being anti-alcohol and the negative impact that it could have on your work, but also family. So you get introduced to Carrie Nation, and I guess she kind of like holds a weird spot in my heart. She's nicknamed the Barroom Smasher, and she would literally go into bars and saloons and bring her little hatchet and go smash up all the different bars and bottles of alcohol and stuff like that. She was known for prohibition. She helped create the Women's Christian Temperance Union. If you take a look at what all is going on in this image, there's a lot of religious verses, and then you have the bartender that's like the Holy Spirit with a hatchet breaking through it, and he's trying to defend his rum and his wine and his whiskey and all his different caskets. You also then have this image here of Carrie Nation. She joined together, as I already mentioned, for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She joined together with Frances Willard for this. They were hoping that prohibition would reduce and end crime, corruption, would help the immigrants assimilate into society. It's just kind of a fun little interesting bit of how far some people would go for their movement, right? So this basically wraps up 25 with more focusing on the societal aspect of things and what it was like living in America and some of the early progressive movement combined with like your populist movement of how can we start to help the American population.